It is known as one of the darkest days in railroad history. Stories of criminal negligence and lack of care for safety. And it was from this accident that exposed the dangers of 19th century rail travel unlike any other before. This is the tragic tale of the Armagh train disaster. June 12th, 1889. It was a calm, warm Sunday that day near the coast of Northern Ireland. At the station platform, a Sunday excursion was in its preparations before boarding. The passengers were hundreds of school children who thought this was going to be the happiest day of their lives. Armagh Sunday School had organized the day trip to the seaside resort of Warren Point, a distance of about 24 miles, as a treat for the children. A special Great Northern Railway of Ireland train was arranged for the journey, with Great Northern number 86 as the locomotive, and Thomas McGath as the driver, with Henry Parkinson as the fireman. The total number of passengers was around 940 people. The railway route was also steeply graded and curved, and the first 2.5 miles from Armagh station involved a steep continuous climb up a gradient of 1.22%, then 1.33%, and elsewhere on the line there were gradients as severe as 1.42%. Those grades may sound like nothing in road terms, but to the trains, those are some pretty steep gradients. Thankfully not as steep as Cacombe Pass's 2.2% grade in the United States. Additional cars had to be coupled to hold all the passengers, which eventually totaled as 15 cars. The engineer, who was a little new to the route at the time, grew concerned and said that his engine couldn't handle the weight and the grade. The limit was 13, not 15. This was the conversation between the engineer and the station master.
I did not write those instructions for you.
Mr. Cohen wrote them.
Any driver that comes here does not grumble about taking an excursion train with him.
Why don't you send a proper word to Dundalk? And I should have a proper 6-wheel coupled engine with me.
However, the engineer's request was denied. He was to go ahead with the one engine and 15 fully loaded cars. The doors were locked, the guard blew his whistle, and the train started off, with the locomotive barely making it out of the station, slipping furiously as it got underway. The train made some progress, but no faster than 10 miles an hour, and it made it up the first 2 gradients, but on the steepest one, the train went slower and slower before coming to a stop about 200 yards up at the top, unable to move a wheel. The crew then get out, wondering what do they do now. They come up with a plan. They were going to split the train in 2, while the locomotive pulled the first half over the hill, then put the coaches in the siding, then go back to receive the second batch before reassembling the train at the other end on the hill, and on they would go. Before doing this though, the guard's brake in the brake van was locked on in the rearmost part of the train to prevent the train from rolling back, and several stones were lodged under the wheels like wheel chocks as extra safety, as wheel chocks weren't standard on passenger trains, but they were standard on freight trains. The guard also put detonators to protect the train from the regularly scheduled 10:35 run, which was scheduled to depart 20 minutes after the excursion. The train also had screw-link couplings and steam pipes, which supplied vacuum brake power to the train. Vacuum brakes work by using steam power to force the brake shoes onto the wheels. It works backwards to most modern brakes that use the steam to keep the brakes off, and if pressure dropped, the brakes would come on automatically. After the train was split, the locomotive slipped once more on the grade and eased back so slightly, and tapped the buffers on the rear portion of the train. And just like that, the rear section began rolling backwards down the hill. At first very slow, so slow the crew could jog alongside, but then it got faster and faster until it was out of reach. The runaway cars were now hurtling at speeds at over 40 miles an hour. Some kids who knew they were in trouble managed to break through the windows and jump, while others had to hold on and pray. Locomotive 86 pursued after the runaway cars, but this proved to be impossible. It was thought the cars would roll all the way back into Armagh. But then, there was the scheduled 10:35 train, which had a similar locomotive like 86 with 6 passenger cars traveling at 30 miles an hour. As the runaway loomed into view, the engineer slammed his brakes and slowed to a mere 5 miles an hour, and then the wooden coaches smashed into mere splinters, and the locomotive of the 10:35 toppled onto its side. Wreckage, people, bodies rolled down the embankment. It was a pitiful sight. The tender and coaches separated from the scheduled train, and the handbrake on the tender managed to stop the coaches, preventing injury. The pursuing first half of the excursion stopped a quarter mile from the disaster. Not so lucky were the people in the rear of the excursion train. Local doctors and soldiers from the barracks came out to help. In the wreckage, rescuers found 80 bodies and 260 people lying in agony by the tracks. Most of the victims were children. The injured were taken to City Hospital, and the dead were taken to the courthouse. Some families, like the Clelands, were totally wiped out. The youngest fatality was just a 2-year-old boy. Queen Victoria sent money to pay for the funerals. The locomotive of the 10:35 was said to have been scrapped after the wreck. The public and the press demanded answers as to why so many children had to die in such a freak accident. Investigators found shocking findings. If the excursion was given a second engine, either at the back or the front, it's likely the train would have made it over the hill without any issue, and the accident would have never took place. Also, one handbrake alone could not hold the second portion of the train. When the screw-link coupling was separated, the steam pipe needed to be unhinged too. At that exact moment, the rear section lost 90% of its sufficient braking power. However, there was more than inadequate brake settings and the lack of sufficient power. There was also the case of the wrong engineer with the wrong engine with the wrong job. The excursion train should have been able to climb up the Armagh bank at around 15 miles an hour. The inspector considered that its failure to do so must have been due to somewhat of proper management of the engine by its insufficiently experienced driver, who had only been on the route as a fireman with a few other excursions and hadn't driven up the road himself. The 240 supplied would have had insufficient margins even when pulling a 13-car train to be sure of maintaining safe speed over the more steep gradients farther up the line. For a 15-car excursion, assistance should have been given by either a larger engine or 2 engines. Other criticisms included that the passengers should not have been allowed to travel in the brake van, which was a practice that was very sternly prohibited. But it was done to fit the large passenger volume. Carriage doors should not have been locked, a wrong thing, but it was done to keep free riders out. Given the weight of the train and the gradients on the line, both brake vans should have been at the rear of the train, not all over the place. And finally, it should have never been such a big train. If it was set that there would be 2 excursions to take half of the passengers, instead of just one for everybody, there wouldn't be the need of such a large train that couldn't be handled on the line. There were various other factors like different engines having vacuum brakes and others having automatic brakes, but the ones previously listed were some of the most affecting. As a result of these findings of negligence, 3 of the accused crew members were committed for trial for manslaughter on the following Monday. The Dundalk personnel were not charged. However, James Elliott, who was part of the general management, was sent to prison. The jury are not reported to have made any findings against the more senior management of the Great Northern Railway of Ireland, although many people think they were still guilty of the accident. However, it wasn't just criminal negligence. The scheduling system put in place at the time was very flawed. Back in the old days, trains ran on an interval system rather than a block signal system. Interval system works somewhat like this. After 5 minutes or so, one train passes. After another 5 minutes, there's another one, and then another, and so on and so on. Having trains follow in such a loose interval system proved dangerous in several accidents across the world, even in the United States. Block systems are different. They work like this. An area between a signal box and stations were known as blocks. When a train passes a block, the signal will go red. The next train would have to stop at the signal, and once the first train passes the next signal, a telegraph message is sent to the train to indicate the line is clear, then the signal would drop, and off the train went. This block system is still in use on modern railroads today, and it's proven to be much safer and even enhanced with the implementation of positive train control, among other safety systems. Also, coaches today are no longer wooden anymore. Steel coaches are the mainstay of passenger trains today, with wooden coaches only being found on a handful of tourist railroads like Strasbourg. 130 years have now passed since the tragedy. While one of the darkest days of railroading, it was thanks to Armagh that trains of today are way safer than the Victorian age of England.